Right off the bat, we are looking at a narrative that completely strips away that glossy, untroubled veneer we usually associate with traditional superhero mythology. You know, the kind I'm talking about. Instead, what we're exposing here is something incredibly raw, desperate, and just profoundly human. We aren't just talking about your standard cosmic action where the good guys punch the bad guys. No, we are dissecting a fundamentally fractured psyche that is somehow trying to save an entirely broken universe. Think of it like this. The architecture of this very different kind of hero isn't built on pristine, untouchable ideals. It's built entirely on the jagged, ugly edges of sheer survival.
Now, I want you to look really closely at the immense psychological weight behind this single sentence. He sees the good in everyone, and I see the truth. Honestly, this right here is the absolute bedrock of the entire narrative. On one hand, you have her cousin's sunny, deeply sheltered worldview. It's a perspective that just assumes benevolence is the default state of the universe, right? But then we have her. She doesn't see the good. She explicitly says she sees the truth, and her version of the truth is a deeply traumatized, survivalist perspective. I mean, really think about what it means for someone to claim a monopoly on the truth in a universe that's absolutely filled with terror. It basically implies that hope is just a delusion, and survival requires a cold, totally unflinching look at the darkness. This isn't just some petty difference of opinion. It is a massive chasm between a hero who was raised in the light and a soldier who was forged in the absolute darkest, most unforgiving fires of loss.
So let's transition and really dig into this ideological divide. It's the deeply personal conflict that anchors this whole story before we even start looking at the bigger picture. What we are calling the hero's truth here isn't some abstract, high-minded philosophical concept. It is a very tactical worldview that has been forged by immense, unimaginable trauma. It is a strict, uncompromising prioritization of survival over any kind of hopeful assumption. You have to understand, this isn't just teenage rebellion. It's not just angst against a famous cousin. This is a fundamentally different, completely hardened way of processing the universe. Look, when your entire world has been destroyed, when you've literally witnessed the absolute worst of what existence has to offer firsthand, you just don't have the luxury of giving your enemies the benefit of the doubt anymore. Your reality is incredibly stark. Your reality is just survival. Every single decision you make is calculated through the lens of what will keep people breathing today, not what's going to keep some moral high ground intact for tomorrow. When we look at this universe, her cousin's incredibly hopeful worldview is treated almost like a luxury item, and it's a luxury that she simply cannot afford. Idealism is a beautiful thing when you're bulletproof, when you're untouchable, but when you're down in the mud, fighting desperately for every single breath, pragmatism is the only thing that's going to keep you alive. What we're watching here is a total deconstruction of the traditional superhero myth. The narrative is actively asking us, is idealism actually a massive liability when the universe is actively trying to destroy you? Her pragmatism is absolutely her shield, for sure. But the tragedy is that it's also this incredibly heavy, isolating armor that completely distances her from the exact people she is trying to protect.
Let's break down this line. My cousin and I have very different ideas about what it means to be a hero. Step by step, she is carving out her own distinct identity here. She isn't a beacon of hope. She's a soldier born from pure necessity. Think about the difference. A beacon just stands still and shines a pretty light for everyone to see. But a soldier goes into the dark and does the incredibly ugly work so that others don't have to. She is telling us, and she's telling herself, that this pristine, untouchable, godlike figure, that is not who she is. She is going to get her hands dirty. She is fully prepared to make those impossible, morally great choices that the pure idealist absolutely refuses to make, simply because the stakes demand absolute conviction.
Now let's smoothly shift our focus away from the personal for a moment and look at the macro level. We're stepping into the galactic stakes that get introduced by a very desperate plea for help. Who brought the destruction? I want us to just linger on this question for a second. Feel the pure dread it instills before the actual antagonist is even fully named. This is just masterful atmospheric tension. The story introduces a void first, this massive, lingering crater of devastation, and it basically forces us to imagine the terrifying off-screen force that's capable of causing it. We're meant to feel the sheer, crushing scale of the threat. We're feeling the ghosts of entire wiped-out civilizations before we ever even see a face. It sets a brilliant tone of inevitable, creeping doom. And then we get the answer. The Bridgens brought destruction. Let me paint a picture of this for you. This specific, definitive declaration completely frames them not just as your run-of-the-mill enemies, but as an overwhelming apocalyptic force. These aren't just villains with some convoluted scheme to rob a bank. They are a cataclysm. They are essentially the living embodiment of the exact trauma she already carries. They're the sweeping tide of ruin that just consumes everything in its path. And honestly, it is precisely this level of existential, universe-ending threat that absolutely necessitates her hardened, pragmatic brand of heroism. An idealist might actually try to reason with an apocalyptic force, right? Holding on to some naive belief in universal redemption. But a survivor knows you simply have to stop them by literally any means necessary.
Consider the sheer, mathematically impossible scale of this mandate, defending every single corner of the universe. I mean, how can one person possibly do this? Well, the short answer is they can't, not without losing a massive piece of their own humanity in the process. This crushing, impossible scale forces a hero to make deeply uncomfortable, purely pragmatic choices on a galactic level. You literally cannot be everywhere at once. You absolutely cannot save everyone, which means you are forced to constantly perform this horrific calculus, constantly choosing who gets to live and who has to die. It is a logistical nightmare all wrapped up in a perpetual moral failing. And the craziest part, that is the exact agonizing burden she is consciously choosing to shoulder.
Okay, let's transition into some really fascinating tonal nuances here. I want to break down exactly how aesthetic choices are actually being weaponized in this story. When you first hear this sudden tonal shift, now it's party, it might feel completely jarring, maybe even out of place. But let me explain why this isn't a joke at all. It is a chilling, deeply ingrained coping mechanism right before engaging in lethal violence. This is raw gallows humor. When you are standing on the edge, about to step into the absolute worst horrors the universe has to offer, sometimes the only way your brain can process that impending trauma is to reframe it with grim, almost totally detached irony. It's like a psychological shield instantly snapping into place before the physical blows even begin. It's a necessary detachment she needs just to survive the absolute bloodletting that is about to follow. Let's slowly unpack the visual genius happening here. The narrative intentionally uses bright, vibrant, pretty colorful imagery. It is deliberately using visual brightness to completely mask a fundamentally dark and incredibly lethal capability. Think of it like a venomous frog in the rainforest, right? The brighter the colors, the more incredibly dangerous the creature actually is. By leaning into this highly saturated, almost comic book aesthetic, the narrative completely lulls its inhabitants, and honestly us as viewers, into a completely false sense of security right before unleashing absolute devastation. The stark contrast makes the violence hit that much harder. That's just so everyone knows we're good. Wow. This brilliantly illustrates the ultimate deception. She deeply, fundamentally understands the PR of being a superhero. She knows exactly what the universe expects. The primary colors, the flowing cape, the shining crest of her family line. And you know what she does? She wears it as camouflage. She is deliberately using the brightly colored savior archetype to hide her ruthless pragmatism completely in plain sight. It allows her to move through the universe totally undetected and constantly underestimated, right up until the exact microsecond she decides to strike. It is a stunningly cynical, yet brilliantly tactical weaponization of her own family's mythology. We are now moving right into the climax of our analysis. This is where all these philosophical differences and this massive cosmic threat finally collide into absolute, unavoidable consequences. You cannot give up on me. I really want you to listen to the raw, unfiltered desperation in this plea. This completely undercuts everything we've seen from her so far. Beneath that incredibly hardened, cynical exterior, beneath all that tactical armor of pragmatism and dark gallows humor, lies an immense, crushing existential dread and a terrifying vulnerability. She is tough because she absolutely, fundamentally has to be, but she is still utterly terrified of being abandoned to the dark. This moment humanizes her instantly. It reminds us that the burden of carrying the hero's truth is incredibly lonely, completely isolating her from the very human connection she's actually fighting so hard to preserve. Only one of you is going to make it. We need to sit with the terrifying finality of this line for a moment. This absolutely shatters the traditional superhero safety net. In most of these mythologies, the heroes always somehow find a magical way to save everyone at the 11th hour, right? They always pull a miraculous victory from the jaws of defeat. But here, no way. The narrative establishes a visceral, absolute zero-sum game of survival. The math is just brutal and unyielding. The idealism of saving everyone is entirely dead here. Now it is just raw, ugly survival, and it demands sacrifices that are going to leave permanent, completely unhealable scars on whoever is lucky enough to be left standing. So what does this all mean?
If traditional, highly idealistic heroes fail because they simply cannot stomach the ugly necessities of survival, then she might actually be exactly what the galaxy needs to stop the Bridgens. But as we wrap this up, we are forced to reckon with a very deep, lingering moral ambiguity. Is the universe truly safe in the hands of a hero whose greatest weapon isn't hope, but her cynical, unflinching truth? When you fight the dark by literally becoming the dark, when you discard every single idealistic notion just to survive the night, what exactly is left to protect when the battle is finally won? Keep that in mind.